Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are delighted to be joined today by criminologist and civil rights attorney Brian Levin, professor and director of the Center for the Study of Hate Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino. Brian was awarded the 2000 Wang Award for Outstanding Scholarship for the whole Cal State research system. Brian, in conversation with AJC Chief Advocacy Officer Dan Elbaum, will discuss and analyze the state of extremism in America today. After we hear from Dan and our esteemed guest, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That is questions plural. Dan, I now turn the floor over to you and Brian.
Thank you, Daniel. And Brian, thank you for joining us. I know that you're always busy, but after last Tuesday, I know you've been particularly busy. So it really means a ton to us to have you on the show with us today. I want to start by asking you, let's go back to last Tuesday's presidential debate. And for those joining for the first time, and I see we have a lot of new first-time joiners, AJC is a nonpartisan organization. 501c3. We do not endorse candidates for any election. And those of you who have joined before have heard this before and will hear it again. But again, to dive into the debate on Tuesday, specifically with the use of terms that some Americans had heard before and some had not, Proud Boys and Antifa. By the way, including perhaps the president, who said he had maybe not heard the term Proud Boy before. Let's start with Proud Boys. Brian, can you tell me, who are the Proud Boys?
The Proud Boys are a neo-fascist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, xenophobic, transphobic group of ne'er-do-well street bigots who are now increasingly armed.
Brian, just don't beat around the bush. What do you think of these guys? I mean...
You know, it's not what I think of them, it's what they are. And you can look at the statements made by their founder, who's no longer with the group, Gavin McInnes, as well as others. But they also were at Charlottesville, and they have provided security at events where there were confrontations with folks from the left. Additionally, they provided security for none other than President Trump's former advisor, Roger Stone.
So if I could ask you for a second, when we go back to the debate, and I'm trying to understand sort of where they fit into the hierarchy of hate. So at the debate, the moderator, Chris Wallace, did not specifically ask about the Proud Boys, right? He asked about white supremacists and militia groups. And then when the president asked for clarification, and in fairness to the president, he did condemn Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups yesterday. We should be clear about that. But going back to Tuesday, when the president asked for clarification of which group he should condemn, Vice President suggested Proud Boys. Now, I'm not asking you to get into the Vice President's mind of why Proud Boys, but where do Proud Boys fit in versus, you know, old school white supremacist organizations, the Klan, David Duke, you know, the National Socialist Movement? Those of us who, you know, are sadly used to these things have heard these terms more. Like, where would you put the Proud Boys within this spectrum?
Great question. What we have seen is a fragmentation and diversification of extremism generally in the United States, and on the hard right fringe, the Proud Boys are one of them. They were at Charlottesville. They have chapters throughout the country. Their adherents have been involved in criminality. One was even charged this week. But they're kind of a platypus. They accept people of color as long as they're Western chauvinists. So in other words, I guess if you were kind of a white nationalist type of person, irrespective of your ethnicity, or a Euro nationalist, they'll have you in. And indeed, their leader is a Cuban-American conservative person who is biracial from Florida. But I think one of the things that we're missing here is that the Proud Boys, that's just one snapshot of a constellation of far-right groups. And I thought what was so interesting is, listen to this. After Charlottesville, a lot of these groups imploded. They lost their leadership. And while the Proud Boys lost their leader, they continued because they tried to put themselves in a position where the type of bigotry that is most overt with them are also ones that have expression within the mainstream: transphobia, Islamophobia, and others as well. But they're also associating with known white supremacists. So they will push back and say, we're not white supremacists, we're Western chauvinists, but they kind of walk and quack like a duck, and they associate with a lot of bad ducks.
Right, and they're pretty happy about being mentioned on Tuesday.
They're ecstatic, and it's terrible. it's absolutely terrible. But here's the thing, you know, these guys are out in public and have a return address, right? They have a scrum of media following them. Unfortunately, I have to talk about them, although I prefer to talk about other folks. Here's the thing, they are symbolic, and they regard themselves as part of an army in support of the president. And unfortunately, what we're worried about, and it's something that we told Congress, it's something that we told the federal authorities and intel folks, is the change in the way extremists are organizing themselves across the ideological spectrum. So what I'm saying to you is, we are more concerned, we're certainly concerned about these ne'er-do-well street bigots who are increasingly more armed, these Proud Boys folks, but it's the stealth, small cell, radicalized loner who is incubated in an ecosystem online and elsewhere, who are steeled for violence. The ones that we don't know about, they're smaller, they're leaner, they're more stealth, and they have a shorter half-life. So groups like the Mason-Adamwaffen division, much more hardcore Nazi types. Proud Boys don't use the overt Nazi and Klan symbols, others do, but the bottom line is we have these meandering tributaries on the hard right, and they all regard whether it's support for the Proud Boys or this amorphous army as kind of a marching order from the president. And that's how the Proud Boys took it, and that's how other extremists are taking it as well.
Now, as I said, many Americans had not heard the term Proud Boy before Tuesday. I think it's fair to say that significantly more Americans had heard of Antifa, although we might differ on how to pronounce it. What can you tell us about that group? Because obviously the president certainly identified them in the debate, and then even in his denunciation of the Proud Boys last night, he would certainly rather we focus on Antifa in terms of the danger that they pose to America.
The problem is Antifa is not a national group. You know, I know of blue-haired grandmas who belong to churches out here in California who had never heard of fly, who label themselves Antifa. I know of scholars who label themselves as anti-fascist. However, at its most hardened fringe, they're opposed to our government, they're opposed to our First Amendment, and at the hardest fringe, they support a certain type of targeted violence around events and against a limited number of people who they regard as antagonists. Generally, they include neo-Nazi folks and folks on the what we used to call the alt-right, but they also attack journalists and police. That being said, it's a movement, and what I would say is, if you look at places like Portland, Seattle, and the Bay Area, they are much more organized and networked. But the bottom line is, there's no equivalency as far as the depth, the reach, and the lethality of the violence. Antifa does not aim for mass casual, random mass casualty attacks against minorities and others. What they generally want to do is either dox folks or show up and peacefully protest against them. There's a whole bunch of Antifa folks who are peaceful. There are others who say by any means necessary and that kind of stuff, but they're more concerned with doxing folks, exposing them, and when they show up in community, these Nazis and Klan people and Proud Boys and others, exposing them, sometimes manhandling them, and kind of tossing them out of the community and from these protests. And certainly some have been involved in property destruction as well. Bottom line is, last year, and I'll show some charts later, we had at least 29 homicides by white supremacists and far right. We had not seen any hard left homicides, at least in the last 5 years. Some researchers say it's more like a quarter century, really? Until this year in Portland. So we have at least one homicide that we're attributing to the hard left, an Antifa partisan, and we're looking at a couple of others. But bottom line, there's no moral equivalency, if you will, and there's certainly no equivalency with regard to the lethality. That being said, and to be clear, there are folks at the hardest fringe of Antifa who are for targeted violence against a narrow but expanding group of antagonists. And
would that include? Who's on that list?
Well, at the top of the list are neo-Nazis, right. The Klan, but it also includes alt-right folks like the Proud Boys. But sometimes it extends to those who disagree with them, journalists, police, and sometimes others. But they opt out. They opt out of our pluralistic democratic system of government. But the violence that they use is much more tamped down, much more directed against property, and much more directed around particular events, and their reach is not as great. But what has happened, and I think this is important, because there's a shell game going on, and it's got to be exposed. First, let me say, our prayers are with the president and his family. However, the president has engaged in a purposeful corruption of the intelligence cycle process, where raw data is analyzed by folks both within government and outside government. And we have been saying before El Paso, before Tree of Life, that this represents the most prominent lethal threat. And additionally, it's increasingly coming from people who are on the margins and tangents of groups. In other words, people who self-radicalize, oftentimes in the cycle that takes place in the socio-political discourse that comes from political leaders and then in cesspools online, including mainstream places like Facebook, for instance.
Right. But it's fair, or tell me, is it fair to say that Antifa or other groups on the fringe and radical left have had a role in riots and other acts of violence in America this year?
Sure. But most of these folks are unaffiliated. You look at the Molotov cocktail couple in New York. You know, they're more from a mainstream kind of progressive movement, but then they radicalized. But sure, they acted independently. And the notion that Antifa is like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or even like the constellation of groups on the far right, is just incorrect. We have in the United States a lengthy history with regard to white supremacy as well as far-right extremism, going back to the silver shirts in the 1930s, who were the American analogs for Hitler's brown shirts. I think in some ways the Proud Boys are playing a bit of that kind of far-right street fighter role today. But there's just no equivalency with regard to the morality, no equivalency with regard to the lethality. But I will say one thing, I'm going to call the Antifa folks out on the extreme side. I'm not talking about my friends who are scholars or who are peaceful protesters. I'm talking about the hardened ones who show up for confrontation. And that is that there is a spectrum of acceptability of violence within Antifa, and at its hardest core, they believe under certain circumstances, in certain places and against particular targets, it is acceptable. And the bottom line is, if you're pro extrajudicial violence,
Right.
we're going to look at you.
Of course. So staying on Antifa, or maybe even taking a step back and broadening the scope and looking at the hard left, I think as American Jews, we don't need to have anti-Semitism on the right explained to us. That is something that is very much ingrained in our DNA in terms of understanding. And if anyone ever had any questions, certainly Pittsburgh and Poway have more than answered that question about the very real, clear and present danger posed by right-wing extremism. What about anti-Semitism on the left, whether in Antifa or in other organizations? Where does this rank in your hierarchy of concerns? Certainly we've seen vitriolic anti-Israel conduct that crosses the line into anti-Semitism on some college campuses, some threats of violence against speakers, other things like that variety. When you look at Antifa and the hard left, are you seeing anti-Semitism?
Yes, but it really is kind of an overflow, for the most part, from anti-Israel positions owing to some of the conduct, some of the egregious conduct that's coming out of the current Israeli government. That being said, I think that we are seeing a situation where Jews are facing bigotry from different directions. And one of the things that's interesting, in the past, we used to see, and you know what, can I share a screen real quick?
Well, we'll have to ask Daniel about that. That's certainly fine with me. Before you do, and I don't want to sidetrack the conversation, we could have a separate discussion about the tactics of the current Israeli government and their response to acts of violence or otherwise. I don't want to sidetrack us, but just to note that certainly I and AJC would disagree with some of that characterization, but we can invite you back for that discussion.
Well, here's the thing. We certainly want nothing but peace in the Middle East, and our center is not anti-Israel. However, what I am saying to you is violent images from the Middle East, if you look at how it affects hate crime and anti-Semitism in the United States, prior to 2018, all the worst months for anti-Semitic hate crime in the United States were around Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
Right.
until October 2018, when we had the worst massacre of Jews in American history. And the following month was the third most numerous for hate crimes that we've seen in about 30 years. So I think from the hard left, the anti-Semitism that exists is a spillover from some of the conflicts that are going on with regard to Israelis and Palestinians.
No dispute there.
However, when we talk about lethal kind of attacks, and particularly most recently, we are now seeing a string of either plots or mass casualty type plans or executions committed by folks on the far right. That being said, what I think Jews have to worry about is a diversification with regard to this threat. There is a narrow sliver, for instance, of Black nationalists, very small group, but we saw what happened with regard to Jersey City with the Black Hebrew Israelites. We are also seeing around the world an increase in far-right populism. And when we have a decline in trust, as we've seen with respect to communal institutions, Jews are often the first stop for these conspiracy theories. So we're concerned that when there's international conflicts, when there are issues relating to violence in the Middle East, and when there is a rise in far-right populism, Jews will be among the most prominent groups to be attacked. And unfortunately, we've been seeing that. Last year, 2019, New York, LA, and Chicago all hit nearly 2-decade highs, and they hit it on Jews being the #1 target in those largest cities. In smaller
Right.
cities, not so much. But we are worried about an increase in violence against Jews, including lethal violence. We're also concerned about the normalization of anti-Semitism. I want to be clear here. I am not condemning the Israeli government as a long-standing elected entity. But what I am saying is when there are images of violence from the Middle East,
Right.
you are going to see that translate into attacks against Jews here in the United States. And by the way, we also see it with regard to attacks against our Muslim friends as neighbors as well. And that's why it's so important, by the way, what American Jewish Committee, and let me do a shout out to you.
Thank you.
For creating MJAC, where folks can get together from different communities and use the American pluralistic democracy as a place where peace can thrive from.
Right. So MJAC, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, which AJC is incredibly proud to have formed. And Brian, I really appreciate you clarifying in terms of Israel, and we have absolutely no dispute that when there's violent images coming out of Israel, we see a surge in hate crimes against Jews and acts of violence against Jews, which, by the way, is anti-Semitic, regardless of one's views on the Israeli government, to blame the American Jewish population for those acts.
Absolutely, but there are controversial positions with regard to who can be citizens, or when we had shootings into Gaza when the embassy was moved, that was extremely volatile. And what I'm saying to you is,
sure,
if we can get a peace process going, I think that will have an ameliorative effect. When there's talk of annexation and all that kind of stuff, what is happening is there's a stereotype that is coming out about Jews and Israel and other things that is also fomented within various communities on the hard left. That being said, I must say that some of the conduct that takes place gives an anchor to this kind of criticism of Israel, which everyone can say is part of reasonable discourse and debate, particular policies by any government. But what I'm saying is when it gets translated through social media and a coarse and divided and polarized American society, you're going to see a similar type of reaction. In other words, we're not talking to each other, we're talking at each other, and that has consequences.
Right. And I think it's fair to say, and hopefully this is our last word on Israel, because we really want to talk about America, is that anti-Semitism from the left is more linked to Israel than the anti-Semitism on the right when we look at it today. That's a fair, it's an oversimplification, but I think a fair one.
That is fair.
Okay, so let's turn to America, because the debate about Proud Boys and Antifa and hate crimes didn't occur in a vacuum, and I know you have some slides you're eager to share. So as somebody who's devoted his life to really studying extremism and counting hate crimes and making sure hate crimes are counted, can you give us an overview with a specific focus on things feel a lot worse? Do they just feel that way, or is the guy who studies the numbers, are they that worse than they were a year, 2 years, 3 years ago?
Well, they're a little better in 2020, only because we've all been locked down and people can't get out to spray paint houses of worship or as easily beat up folks. But I'll tell you something. We're seeing a confluence both in the acceptability of anti-Semitism as well as hate crimes in certain quarters. And what we saw was a couple of years ago, anti-Semitic hate crimes peaked, including violent ones. They then went down a little bit, but they're still up near multi-year highs. This year, 2020, many cities like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, anti-Semitic hate crimes are down, but I think that's more of a function of the fact that people have been locked down.
Right, all crime is down, or in general, right?
Well, not all homicides are up and car thefts because people leave their cars parked. But the bottom line is we have entered a new phase. Jews are still very, very much accepted here in the United States, but we're seeing a softening of that acceptance. And what I'll do is I will post on Twitter at Prof. Levin our report from last year where you can see multi-year trends. But bottom line is, I think we've hit a little bit of a ceiling with respect to the warm feelings that American society has had for Jews. And remember, we Jews are the most warmly regarded faith group in the United States. But when you look at some of the polling, for instance, ABC Washington Post a couple of years ago, I think it's a little high, but 9% of Americans say Nazi views are acceptable. That's something. 43% of Americans, according to Reuters Ipsos, say whites are under attack. So unfortunately, Jews, when they are targeted from a multiplicity of places, including from certain pockets on the hard left, certainly on the hard right, and in some areas from other communities as well, and certainly on college campuses, and we're quite concerned about that. And we also want to say in this election season, we are reiterating our threat advisory, and unfortunately, when institutions are degraded, Jews are the ones who are blamed for it. So we are concerned about a possible escalation in anti-Semitic incidents or attacks running into the election and thereafter.
So when you say you're reiterating your threat advisory, just sort of translate that for our audience. That means there's a greater level of threat to American Jews for hate crimes in general, or sort of define that for me of what that means.
Oh, sure. Look, the 3 worst months for hate crime over the last decade, FBI disaggregated data, which our team did, it ain't just me. November 2016, day after election day, worst day for hate crime going back to June 2003. November 2016, yeah, November 2016.
And was there, I'm sorry, just let's stay on that for a moment. Was there one group that was more targeted when you look at that data? If you remember, was there one group that was most targeted after the election?
The biggest percentage increase was actually against Latinos, but Jews got hit by the wave too. Right. Here's the thing though, the second worst month for hate crime, October 2018. Notice that when the right won, and I'm talking just in the mainstream, when the right won the presidency, there was kind of a celebratory boost after the election, right? However, the second worst month, October 2018. And what did we see? The worst massacre of Jews just days before the election, October 27th, the Tree of Life massacre. Right. And what else did we see around that time? Talk about the caravans for which the Jews were blamed, as well as some racial homicides. We saw Cesar Sayoc sending fake pipe bombs to people. And that came in the run-up to the election, right? Third worst month, Charlottesville month. But Jews, we saw a significant increase around all of them. Let me just say something. The increase, the spike that we saw post-Charlottesville came the day of and the 5 days after President Trump's very fine people statement. So what I'm saying to you is, it is for the, we don't endorse candidates. We never have and we never will. But we also roll up our sleeves and roll the truth out too. And when the president made those statements, hate crimes peaked for that third worst month. In fact, we saw a 50% peak at its worst from the average daily number of hate crimes for that whole year as a total. In other words, we had days where hate crimes in the United States after his statement on that Monday went 30 or more. So it affects Jews, but one of the things I think is interesting is when groups are stereotyped and put into this spin cycle of conspiracy theories and derision on some TV networks and on social media, we see that translate into attacks on the street. So 10 years ago, it was Latinos. Then mid-decade, we saw a rise in attacks against Muslims. And indeed, mid-decade, we saw more assaults against Muslims than we did after 9/11, even though the aggregate numbers were somewhat lower. And then we had other groups kind of replace Muslims as kind of this flavor of the day for hate.
Right.
Jews are generally between 10 and 13% of the hate crimes in the United States, although they're only about 2% of the population.
Right.
But what
it
we're
feels
seeing
like we're always in fashion, right? Like these other groups go up and down, but the Jews remain a constant in terms of hate crimes.
Yeah, unfortunately so. And moreover, what we see, it reflects in what is in the socio-political discourse. So 10 years ago it was Latinos, then Muslims mid-decade, peaked with a head and shoulder peak, and then who came back in to replace them? Latinos. And then who this year, in fact, hate crimes are down in nearly all the cities in the United States, except major ones, except Los Angeles, and except for a couple of groups. Anti-Asian hate crimes in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, not everywhere. But what we're seeing is a big surge, particularly matched to a timing of COVID deaths and presidential statements relating to ethnicity and Asians. So we have had more hate crimes against Asians in most cities in just a couple of months than the annual total for going back a while. So when the 2020 data is finally in, we're going to see, unfortunately, that this is the year for attacks, unfortunately, against our Asian brothers and sisters. And we're seeing, listen to this, just in the informally reported assaults that are coming in through these portals, just criminal assaults, we've seen more of those this year than all the hate crimes against Asians, including graffiti and other stuff, from the previous year easily. Big surge in anti-Asian hate crime, but it tended to run with the increase in deaths and statements around it. Interestingly, one quick thing, when the president on March 23rd had an oasis moment where he said that we should be tolerant of Asians, anti-Asian hate speech online briefly paused.
Interesting, because I wanted to point out that the president did make clear that he was speaking about the country China and not Chinese Americans and everything else. But as you say, the rhetoric was what the rhetoric was and the results were what the results were. Brian, I really want to ask you both about the report your center issued about extremist murders, and I also want to talk about the No Hate Act, which we have no small amount of pride for having a role in really pushing, and it passed a significant hurdle yesterday. But I know I promised you and you've promised the audience a chance to see some slides. So I'm going to just throw that back at you, but we do want to get to audience questions.
Yeah, let me know if you guys can see it, because sometimes my screen doesn't show what you guys can see. So let's see if I can do this. If
you can, if not, like I said, I've got other questions, and we'll
all
get
right, yeah, we'll try and go through them real quick. Can you see the slides at all?
Yes.
All right. I'm just going to skip through some of them. Look, here's some of these haters. And interestingly enough, see that group RAM? They were actually an underground group, and they had a series of federal charges against them until a judge threw out the law that they were charged with. Here's your Proud Boys, by the way. Lovely folks. Here's what our analysis said before El Paso. I'm not going to read it out, but white nationalism, far-right extremism, most ascendant. And then we talked about that these folks would maintain their position on the top of a diversifying threat matrix. And particularly, we also look at these loners and small cells who are incubated in a system. Look, white supremacy, this is just from 2016 to 18. That was most of the occurrences. But then let's break it down into homicides, okay? Red are the white supremacist far right. And you can see in 2016 over here, there were only 3. What were the white supremacists and far right folks doing? They were marching. They had a public face, an overt public face, so they tamped down their violence when they were trying to enter the mainstream. And we saw more mega, not MAGA, big rallies by white nationalists and white supremacists in the 2.5 years leading just into and after Charlottesville than easily that we've seen in the previous 10 to 15 years. So bigotry will manifest itself sometimes in more nonviolent ways when folks are trying to enter the mainstream. But look at this.
Right. And Brian, don't leave this slide. I've got questions. So, but no, show me this. Talk about 2019. But I just want to stay on here because I want to clarify, or I want to get clarity on a few things.
Yeah, and just real quick, when I reference the cities, look over here. These three cities, which have among the largest Jewish population. Remember, Jews tend to live in the bigger cities. They're 4.4% of the population, the top 21 cities, but only about 2.1%, 2.2% of the American population. And where are they clustered? In large cities like New York, LA, and Chicago. And that's also where it's easy to find more observant and overtly identifiable Jewish folks, like our Orthodox brothers and sisters. One last thing I want to show you. Look at this. Look at this. This is some previous highs with regard to all types of hate crime, right? Peak 9/11 time. But look at this. November 2016, and then conflictual midterm election. So these are all of great concern. Let me also just give you anti-Semitic real quick. Look at this. The worst months over the last decade. Here you go. November. Now this is volume, not lethality, because then the worst month would be October over here. But the worst month this decade for anti-Semitic hate crimes, November 2016. And if we go back, a lot of this other stuff, here's around an Intifada time. And we also had a terrorist attack that a wonderful young Jewish yeshiva student was murdered in New York. That was a terror attack that came in March. The Hebron massacre took place at the end of February. So there you go. You can see this graphically. Last one. Here's where anti-Semitic incidents have been going. We had a decline. Our 30-year low, if you will, came in 2014 for all types of hate crime. And then here in blue, we saw this increase in anti-Semitic. We had a bit of a slight decline in 2018. We're thinking that there will probably be an increase, at least in major places where Jews are represent a significant amount of the population. Let me give you one last thing. New Jersey hit a record in 2019, and they haven't released the breakdown of the data. We believe that that's going to be, unfortunately, because of a surge in anti-Semitic incidents that match that kind of city chart. But you really have to look at each individual community.
Right. Let me say you were right. You definitely did need to show these slides. This is a ton of information, but incredibly helpful. Going back to the slide, you don't need to show it, but when we talked about the surge in white supremacist related murders from this year or from last year, who are they killing? Are these all targeting of victims of minorities? Are they killing each other? Is this law enforcement? Who are the victims of these crimes?
Well, certainly law enforcement, for instance, Boogaloo Boys, and adhering to that, killed a federal protective contract officer as well as a sheriff in Northern California. There was just a shootout this week where a white supremacist was killed in Central California. And one of the homicides that took place in these car ramming incidents that we're looking at, one of the fellows who did it here in California appeared to be a white supremacist, but the investigation is still ongoing, and he was killed in Mexico recently. He's also a ne'er-do-well criminal. So the bottom line is for Jews, unfortunately, we've seen the attacks come from the far right, for instance, Poway, as well as Tree of Life. But we've also saw, for instance, the attack in Jersey City. And that was by a very small group. And this is what's interesting. The Black Hebrew Israelites are quite small. But we've seen violence and certainly some confrontational behavior by these folks, including the horrendous attack in Jersey City late last year.
Right. And Brian, maybe members of the audience eyes are better than mine, but I don't want to sort of lean into the camera right now. Could you also tell us what the black, green, and brown are when we look, just so when we look at these different murders? Oh yeah, sure. Violent Salafist jihadists are in black, and look at how that cratered. Most of this stuff from 2016 was the Pulse nightclub massacre.
which killed 49 people. But then, look, went down the next year. And I think that's related to the fact that Daesh and Al-Qaeda had been severely impacted. But now they're rising up again. So we'll see what happens. Look at that. See, we saw a little bit more of an increase. But who else have we seen? We're all, and this is something I think we have to acknowledge. It is becoming increasingly difficult to categorize these extremists, because in the past they joined a group, they joined the Klan, they joined Daesh, or some other kind of group. Now, what we're seeing are folks who are influenced by groups,
right,
but they take from a buffet across the spectrum. And we'll see, for instance, sometimes hard right people expressing sympathy for something that we thought were more of a lefty thing, like employment for blue collar workers or the environment and things like that. So we're seeing an idiosyncratic wild card mix. And there was a real interesting story in The Intercept that explored whether or not the Las Vegas massacre had some connection to extremism. Bottom line is, we're seeing a mix where people are taking personal grievance and
right,
turning it into something political, and oftentimes mixed or hard to identify.
right. And I suppose it makes your job as someone who identifies it harder, right? Because 20 years ago, someone joined the Klan, they had they had to drive over to the meeting, pay their membership dues, and we could attribute that murder to the Klan. Now, when it's motivated by what they see on social media or others, we cannot always, I imagine, completely account for the cocktail of hateful ideologies that found their way into this person's mind that led them to commit the crime.
Excellent point. And what we see with symbolic violence, three types. First, the ideologically motivated, could be religious, political, or a hybrid. Second, the psychologically dangerous. Third, grievance, personal benefit or revenge. And we often see it mixed up. And what I'm saying is, sometimes I think what we're going to see going forward are folks whose primary reason for these symbolic or mass attacks is a personal grievance that got some kind of anchoring into even tangentially an ideology. And because we're dealing with freelancers now, in other words, we believe, and again, the leaked DHS report and stuff that's coming out of the FBI, it looks almost identical to the stuff that we've been coming out with the last several years. So we're seeing a diversification of extremism. We're also seeing a diversification in how extremists organize. And increasingly, and this is the thing with regard when people are talking about like Antifa. Antifa is a movement. Most of these folks are totally peaceful, and they're about confronting and exposing bigots. At the fringe, they're different. But bottom line is, organizationally, we're seeing the rise of the radicalized loner who was in an ecosystem of hate. We're seeing duos and small cells that don't really answer to any greater hierarchy, and they often combine a mix of hatreds, some of which might appear to be confusing. Like, for instance, we saw Proud Boys in Salt Lake City, that particular chapter, get together with BLM. We saw Boogaloo Boys, who, not all of whom are white supremacists. Boogaloo Boys believe a civil war is coming. Some of them have said, oh no, we support Black Lives Matter because we don't like police or something. But most of this stuff veers exactly the way you think it would. We're also concerned about another type of extremism, kind of a vigilante extremism that's being encouraged by statements out of certain campaigns talking about armies and kind of deputizing people. Earlier in the year, the Trump administration, at the same time that they were intentionally downplaying the far right risk, were talking about deputizing regular citizens to apprehend undocumented people. So the more that we have this law and order message that is being taken as a call to arms, and by the way, within the mainstream as well, it's a spectrum. So you have civil guard, you have militias, paramilitary groups, as well as people who justify violence, some to maintain order, but some for more nefarious reasons. But the bottom line is, when we're having increasingly armed groups showing up at conflictual events, that's a recipe for disaster.
Right. So Brian, let me ask my final question, then we'll turn it over to our guests, because I know we have a ton of people on and a lot of questions. But your data is largely based on the FBI's numbers, and I'm about to ask you an impossible question of, can you briefly explain, and briefly, because I really do want to get to some questions from the audience, some of the challenges in the FBI's accumulation of this data? Because obviously we're only as good as the numbers that we get. But as I mentioned to you, I'm a former prosecutor. I remember the challenges with both having victims report and agencies and states reporting these types of things.
Yeah, reporting really varies. New Jersey reported over 1,000 cases, hate crimes in 2019. California also a bit over 1,000, but we're like 5 times the size. Then we have states, and this is a problem, particularly in the South and in some rural places, where we're just not getting data, like Mississippi, which sends 0 to 5 in any given year. Alabama, 0 to 10. And these are states that have among the highest population of African Americans, so we're not getting a full picture. But here's what's good about the FBI data. It's excellent for trend analysis. In other words, if you have 1,000 rain buckets spread throughout the United States and 100 of them are knocked over, you still can see where the rain is falling and how bad. But in those states where all the rain buckets are kicked over, we're not getting that kind of reporting. Luckily, from the Jewish community, because of wonderful organizations like yours, there seems to be a better relationship with law enforcement. But bottom line, that's why we support you and your efforts with a variety of hate crime legislation. And we need to have a redoubling of efforts to train police and get better data. But the thing that bothers me when people say, well, the data is incomplete, that is true. But for trend analysis and chronological analysis, it's highly effective.
Right. And by the way, thank you for your warm words about AJC, and you've been a valuable partner to us as we've worked to try to pass the No Hate Act, as we've worked to improve relations with law enforcement, the data that you've provided, the assistance you've supported. You always say yes, and it means the world to us.
Daniel, and also your efforts to foment peace in the Middle East. And sometimes, AJC takes a little bit of a hit from saying, you know what, we're pursuing peace and we're going to do things a certain way. We are right with you with that. We want nothing but peace between Israel, the Palestinians, and their Arab neighbors.
As the vice president might say, inshallah. So Daniel, let me turn it over to you for questions from the audience.
Thank you, Dan. And continuing on that point that you were just making, Brian, we have a question from Alex Brodsky in Washington, D.C., who is asking for you to describe to us the challenges that law enforcement authorities face as they collect, report hate crimes data. And from the dozens of cities whose police reports your team studies, do you see any best practices for reporting and recording hate crimes that should be adopted by other cities?
Yes, but this year, all the cities are having difficulty getting timely hate crime data out. I would say probably as far as data collection, New York City is very good. And they are now updating monthly, so that's good. Anti-Semitic hate crimes in New York are down, thank goodness, this year. Los Angeles, very good. Seattle had a very interesting data collection portal, which was good. So we're seeing pockets where this stuff works. What makes the biggest difference are having state laws, having training, having a message from the top, and a 2-tier type of review where a responding officer should pass it up the chain if there is any suspicion that something might be a hate crime. So New York, LA, the biggest cities, but some cities are really not doing a good job, unfortunately. Washington, D.C. does a very good job with respect to data collection. But I'll tell you what cities don't do a good job, and cities that have a large number, or regions that have a large number of Jewish folks. Florida has not, Miami did not report a single hate crime for most of last decade until like 2018. That's unacceptable to have major cities.
The whole state.
No, Miami. But
Miami, I'm sorry, the whole city, you're right.
Yeah, but we were seeing more hate crimes reported by Boston than the whole state of Florida. for years. So it's really uneven, and that's why we join you in submitting statements and going to Congress to pass laws that will aid police departments to train, have a two-tier system, and also, really important, a message from the chief. And unfortunately, we have right now a social construction that says that most hate crimes are hoaxes on the far right. And it's a lie. Andy No said the real surge in hate crimes after the election were in hoaxes. And he found like a half dozen. There were 758 hate crimes that month. So it's baloney. Even a book that's called Hate Crime Hoaxes, listen to this. There was a swastika that was made into a menorah that was made into a swastika. And they said that that was a hoax because the people who didn't weren't white supremacists. You know, it's ridiculous. The numbers don't lie.
They don't. And Daniel, real quick, for the over 1,000 people on Zoom and the tens of thousands watching on social media, I'd urge you to go to our website, ajc.org, and click on the action alert for the No Hate Act to encourage reporting from law enforcement jurisdictions. Because really, like for a city like Miami to report no hate crimes, and for the challenges we've had in so many of these states, we really need to have your voice heard.
Our next question comes from Ray Termini in Dallas. In an opinion in the Wall Street Journal this morning, the author stated that Antifa's lack of a central structure is what makes it effective at imposing disorder in American cities. The author also points out that because it is not a conventional organization, it is difficult to bring criminal charges against its leaders and financial backers. How do you differentiate between peaceful Antifa and the non-peaceful rioters, and how does law enforcement deal with this?
Great question. You know, I've gone to a bunch of rallies, and most of the Antifa folks are peaceful. But I'll tell you, and one of the things, and I hope nobody ever has to experience that, I saw a man almost killed. Unfortunately, he was the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was attacked in Anaheim with rods, 2x4s, and I stood over him and escorted him out. And I also have a death threat from the hard left as well. That being said, though, there has been an orchestrated effort to make this so-called Antifa threat bigger, more organized, more lethal than it is. But I would say that the points made by your questioner are true, at least to a certain extent. And what I mean is, I think, like, frankly, those who are networked, it's really in a limited number of cities where they're the most coalesced. Portland, Seattle, Bay Area. However, it does pose an issue for law enforcement when there are some folks who do coordinate and we don't know who they are. But when you look at the protests, for instance, and the research coming out like Princeton that said 95% of them were peaceful, I don't want to be a part of a social construction of an Antifa violence epidemic that doesn't exist. And I think that the administration and some of the minions in the media and online are purposely taking this Antifa threat and exaggerating, saying there's plane loads of Antifa going places. No. Saying that they started the wildfires. No. So the conspiracy world about Antifa is so out of whack to what the reality is. And the bottom line is, I'll tell you something. As far as anti-fascist, I'm Antifa then. But if it's going to mean that I have accept the fringe folks who say that violence is okay and that they can beat up journalists and cops, no. But it's a movement, and the problem with it is because it's not a group but a movement. Antifa is in the eyes of the beholder. From the blue-haired lady up in Sacramento who goes to church, who never heard a fly, to students who want to shout down these bigots, and good for them, and expose them for what they are. Others who are doxing folks. That's what most of it is. But if you're saying, are there folks who act as kind of semi-independent or independent operators? Yeah, but I think a lot of the violence are from criminals and opportunists and not hard left ideologues. And I really am concerned about promoting a stereotype that says Antifa is this omnipresent boogeyman, when most of the folks who say that they're Antifa, including people I know, are nonviolent and would never do violence, but they would loudly confront these folks in public. Some of these folks may dox Antifa. And most of the time, I'll tell you, when I've seen this stuff, not all the time, it's really more about expelling and twirling, manhandling these folks out. But now that we're having an escalation with regard to political violence generally, you know, all bets are off, because we've been seeing a trend. Of course, you know, one is like Jupiter and the other is like Mars, but we are seeing a trend of increasing polarization and an arms race. And bottom line is, when you have large gatherings, those are the times when these hard left people are most likely to be in confrontational situations. But we don't see the kind of mass casualty, random attacks. We don't have the breadth with regard to the far right, because remember, the history of the Klan in the United States goes back to 1865. We don't have that history with regard to the hard left and Antifa. One last thing. Here's another reason why Antifa is not the threat that others are. By the way, could someone who is a hard left partisan commit an act tomorrow? Absolutely. But bottom line is the folklore, the instrumentalities, the reach, and how they recruit is different. So what we are seeing is an energized left that is participating in the political process. And when people feel that they have a stake in things, just like what we saw with the far right in 2016, when they were doing more marching and less killing, I think that's something. In other words, violence for Antifa, even for among the most hardened ones, is usually considered a targeted thing as a last resort. That being said, I abhor any group that wants to use violence for ideological purposes. But the threat is just so exaggerated by this administration, and what they're then doing is fomenting this kind of paranoia on the hard right about these Antifa folks going into the suburbs and law and order. It's garbage, it's wrong, and I don't want to be a part of that. But as someone who's an analyst, I do have to say the threat from the hard left, while significantly less, materially less, is not non-existent.
Thank you, Brian. We actually have just enough time for one final question. It'll have to be quick, but I want to ask it because I know it's been coming from several people, including from AJC leader Gail Binderman in New York. Social trends often emerge from universities. You said you are concerned about universities. Can you explain a bit about what you're watching specifically?
Yeah, look, recently, Layla Khalid was supposed to talk at San Francisco State. By the way, First Amendment, I support even the right of extremists to speak, like Ahmadinejad on college campuses, although I wouldn't invite them.
Tell the audience who she is.
She was a terrorist with a PFLP who hijacked a plane, was unsuccessful in it, but the 3 other planes were blown up in a widely covered news event on Dawson Field in 1970. So she's kind of regarded as a hero. I think it's terrible that folks would invite her, but nevertheless, I support the right of even haters to be challenged. That being said, on college campuses, it is increasingly difficult for Jewish students, and I think a lot of that is coming from the fact of antipathy against Israel. And again, I called it one way before, I'll call it another way now. I think there's a double standard. I vigorously disagree with some of the things that the current government there is doing. However, when you look at the level of scrutiny against what's happening there versus other countries, it smells to me like anti-Semitism. And what I'm saying to you is this is making a hostile place for Jewish students, including in campuses here in California. And we have to make a greater effort to bring folks together to say, what do we share? And that's why the stuff that you're doing with MJAC, we work with the Muslim community. Some of the charts you saw today, some of the work that we've been doing with respect to anti-Semitism is being done by committed Muslim friends and neighbors. So what we have to do is use this as an opportunity to have peace start here and then go there, because we're a pluralistic democracy that lionizes religious pluralism.
Thank you, Brian. And certainly I share your sentiment about the double standard of Israel toward Israel on college campuses. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me just turn it over to my colleague, Daniel, for some final words.
Yes, thank you very much, Brian. That was a very informative conversation. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Again, everyone, thank you. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, and goodbye.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.